Last night, Trieu Duong struggled to care for his 3-month-old daughter as her fever rose. The dim light barely enough to see her face, and by morning he realized their home wasn't safe when night came. So without hesitation, he decided to harvest cucumbers, rush to the market, and buy lights to protect their small home before darkness returned. But with time slipping away, will he finish it all in time? If you enjoy warm, heartfelt stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. The night before had been one of those long, anxious nights that felt even heavier because Truc Lam was still so little. At just 3 months old, she was still fragile in every way that made her father extra careful. When her body grew warm with fever, Trieu Duong barely let himself rest. He stayed beside her the whole night, touching her forehead again and again, listening to her breathing, watching every tiny movement she made. Even when she drifted into a light sleep, he did not dare relax completely. He kept one hand near her, ready in case she stirred, cried, or seemed uncomfortable again. What made the night harder was the weak light inside the house. The old bulb hanging overhead was so dim that it barely lit the room. The corners stayed buried in shadow, and even near the bed the light felt dull and tired. Each time Trieu Duong needed to check Truc Lam's face, reach for her, bottle, or look around for the things he needed, he had to lean in close and strain his eyes. In a quiet night filled with worry, that darkness made everything feel more unsettling. He kept thinking the same thing over and over. This was not enough. Not for a father caring for a 3-month-old baby through a feverish night. By morning, the fever had started to ease. Soft daylight slowly slipped into the house, and the room finally felt less tense. Trieu Duong looked down and saw that Truc Lam's face was calmer than it had been a few hours earlier. The heat in her forehead seemed lighter now. Her tiny hands moved slowly in front of her chest, and her eyes opened with that soft, sleepy look babies have when they are just beginning to wake. That one small change was enough to loosen the fear he had been carrying all night. He leaned close and spoke to her gently. His voice stayed low and warm, full of reassurance. He lifted her carefully into his arms, supporting her head the way he always did, and held her against his chest for a moment before feeding her. At 3 months old, she was still so small that every movement around her had to be soft and deliberate. He never rushed when it came to her. He fed her slowly, watching her drink, watching her expression, waiting to see whether she seemed comfortable. When she settled after eating, he wiped her mouth, adjusted her clothes, and gently rocked her in his arms. For a moment, it felt like the house could breathe again. Then his eyes went back to the dim bulb. The memory of the night returned immediately. He thought about how difficult it had been to care for her in such poor light. He thought about the yard outside too, and the vegetable garden beyond it. Once evening came, the whole area around their home disappeared into shadow too quickly. The paths were hard to see. The spaces around the garden were difficult to watch clearly. If he heard even a small sound outside, he had to step closer and peer into the dark before knowing what was there. With a baby as young as Truc Lam, he could not ignore that problem anymore. He wanted brighter light inside the house, where she slept and fed and rested in his arms. He wanted more light outside too, around the yard and the vegetable patch. So when night came, he could see clearly, move safely, and keep watch over the space around them. It was not about comfort alone. It was about protection. It was about making sure that when darkness returned, he would be better prepared than he had been the night before. But adding lights meant spending money. Trieu Duong stood in the doorway for a moment, holding Truc Lam close and looking toward the vegetable garden. Then his eyes settled on the cucumber patch. The cucumbers were ready. There were enough to harvest, and if he brought them to the market that morning, maybe he could earn enough to buy more lights for the house and the garden. The thought became a decision almost immediately. After making sure Truc Lam was calm and comfortable, he got ready for the morning. Because she was only 3 months old, he did everything with extra care. He wrapped her securely to his chest first while preparing, keeping her close where he could watch her easily. He checked that her head was supported well and that the cloth was snug but gentle. He paused more than once to make sure she could breathe comfortably and rest against him without strain. Only when he was certain she was settled did he take a basket and walk with her toward the cucumber patch. The morning air was cool and fresh. Dew still clung to the leaves, and the cucumber vines spread across the soil in healthy green lines. Trieu Duong crouched down and began picking carefully. He moved slower than usual because he had Truc Lam with him and because he did not want to jostle her. He reached under the leaves, found the ripe cucumbers one by one, and twisted them free with steady hands. Every few moments, he glanced down at her face to make sure she was still peaceful. She stayed quiet against him, soothed by his warmth and the gentle rhythm of his movements. There was something deeply tender in the scene. A father who had spent the whole night worrying for his baby now stood in the soft morning light, harvesting vegetables with one purpose in mind: to make their home brighter and safer before darkness came again. He did not complain about being tired. He did not think about rest first. His mind stayed fixed on what needed to be done for the two of them. The basket slowly filled. He placed each cucumber neatly inside, careful not to bruise them. The vines rustled softly each time he moved. Birds called from the trees nearby. Truc Lam made a small, sleepy sound once, and Trieu Duong immediately paused, one hand leaving the basket just to touch her lightly and reassure her. When she settled again, he kept working. Once he had enough cucumbers to sell, he returned to the house. Before leaving for the market, he took time to care for Truc Lam again. He fed her once more, changed her, and made sure she was shaded and comfortable for the trip. At her age, she could not simply be carried through a busy day without preparation. Trieu Duong knew that every outing had to follow her needs, not his own pace. He checked everything twice: her wrap, her position, her little blanket, the way her head rested, before finally lifting the basket of cucumbers and setting off. The road to the market felt longer after a sleepless night. Still, he kept walking. His steps were steady, even if his body was tired. The memory of the previous night stayed close in his mind. The fever, the weak bulb, the dark corners of the house, the uneasiness of not being able to see clearly when his daughter needed him most. That memory pushed him forward more than anything else. By the time he reached the market, the place was already busy. Vendors were arranging vegetables, baskets, and small household goods. Voices drifted through the air. Trieu Duong found a simple place to sit and laid out the cucumbers neatly. They were fresh and green, and it did not take long for people to notice them. Some customers stopped because the cucumbers looked good. Others noticed the tiny baby close to him and gave him a second look. Trieu Duong stayed focused and polite. He greeted customers, sold the cucumbers one by one, and kept glancing down at Truc Lam between each sale. At 3 months old, she spent most of the time resting quietly, nestled against him. Every so often, he adjusted the cloth gently or rested a hand against her to make sure she was comfortable. Selling vegetables and caring for his daughter happened at the same time, woven together as part of the same responsibility. Little by little, the basket emptied. With every cucumber sold, hope grew stronger. He counted the money carefully in his head, knowing exactly why he was there. When the last few were gone, he gathered the bills and went to a nearby stall that sold electrical supplies. There he examined light bulbs, wires, sockets, and simple outdoor lights. He chose them with care, thinking not about decoration, but about safety. One brighter light for inside the house would help him care for Truc Lam at night. More lights outside could help him see the yard and garden paths clearly after sunset. If he could finish installing them before evening, then maybe tonight would feel different. Maybe tonight, if Truc Lam woke again, he would not have to struggle in the shadows. He paid for the supplies, tied them together, adjusted Truc Lam gently in his arms, and started back home. Now the day felt more urgent than before. He had the lights, he had the wires, he had the reason. But the sun was already moving higher, and there was still so much left to do before darkness came again. Would Trieu Duong be able to install every light in time and make the house and garden safer before night fell once more? The moment Trieu Duong stepped back into the yard, the sunlight had already shifted. It was no longer the soft, gentle light of early morning. The sun now stood higher, brighter, and more unforgiving. Time had quietly moved forward while he was at the market, and he could feel it immediately. He didn't need to look at the sky for long to understand one thing clearly. There wasn't much time left before evening. But before anything else, his attention went straight to Truc Lam. He carefully untied the cloth and brought her into his arms. At just 3 months old, she couldn't be left unattended, not even for a moment. He checked her face first, brushing his fingers lightly across her forehead. The warmth from the night before was gone. Her skin felt normal again, soft and cool. That small confirmation eased his heart. He carried her inside and laid her gently in her sleeping area. But he didn't step away right away. He adjusted the blanket around her, made sure her head was turned comfortably to one side, and stayed there for a few seconds longer than necessary, just watching. Even now, after the fever had passed, he still needed that reassurance. Only when she seemed fully calm did he begin preparing for the work ahead. Outside, he placed the bundle of electrical supplies on the ground and slowly unpacked everything. Light bulbs, wires, sockets, simple fixtures, nothing fancy, but each piece carried a purpose. He arranged them neatly, mentally planning where each light would go. Inside the house first. That dim bulb from last night had to be replaced. He needed a stronger, clearer light where Truc Lam slept, where he fed her, where he watched over her through the quiet hours. Then outside, the yard, the path leading to the garden, and the edges of the vegetable patch. Those were the places where darkness gathered. Quickly, those were the places he needed to see clearly. He picked up his tools. Before starting, he glanced back inside again. Truc Lam was still lying peacefully, her small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The sight gave him just enough confidence to begin. He moved quickly, but never carelessly. The first task was the bulb inside the house. He removed the old one and replaced it with a brighter light. When he tested it, the change was immediate. The room filled with a clean, steady brightness that reached the corners that had been hidden before. The shadows pulled back. For the first time, the space felt open, visible, safe. He paused for a second, looking around. This alone already made a difference. But he didn't stop. He stepped outside again and began working on the yard lights. This part was harder. He had to run wires carefully along the edges, secure them properly, and position each light so it would cover the right areas. He moved from one point to another, thinking ahead with every step. Sometimes he had to crouch low to fix a connection. Sometimes he had to stand and stretch to reach higher spots. And every few minutes, without fail, he turned his head toward the house, listening, checking, making sure there was no sound from inside. The work demanded focus, but his mind was split in two. One part on the task, the other always on Truc Lam. A soft cry broke the quiet. He stopped immediately. Without hesitation, he set the tools down and walked quickly inside. Truc Lam had stirred from her sleep, her tiny face slightly scrunched, her arms moving gently in the air. Maybe she felt uncomfortable, or maybe she just needed to feel his presence again. He didn't try to guess too much. He simply picked her up. Holding her close, he gently rocked her, his hands supporting her head as always. His voice returned to that same soft tone, the one he used through the night before. He didn't rush to put her down again. He stayed with her until her body relaxed, until her small movements slowed, until her breathing settled. But this time, he made a different choice. He knew the work outside would take time, so instead of laying her back down, he tied her securely to his chest. At 3 months old, she was still light enough to carry this way, close enough for him to feel every small movement, every breath. He adjusted the cloth carefully, making sure she was comfortable, supported and shaded from the sun. Then he stepped back outside. Now the work continued, but with her right there with him. Every movement became even more controlled. When he bent down, he did it slowly. When he reached up, he made sure his balance stayed steady. One hand often checked the cloth instinctively, even when he knew it was secure. The sun continued to move. The light began to soften just slightly, a quiet sign that afternoon was beginning to lean toward evening. He quickened his pace. The first outdoor light was fixed near the doorway. He tested it. It worked. The second went along the path leading to the garden. He adjusted its angle carefully so it would spread across the ground instead of pointing too high. When he turned it on briefly to test, the path lit up clearly. The third was placed near the edge of the vegetable patch. That one mattered. That area had been the darkest the night before. It was where shadows gathered the fastest, where shapes blurred together, where he felt the most uncertain. He worked more carefully here, securing the wires properly, making sure nothing was loose. Sweat began to form along his forehead. His hands moved faster now, but his attention never slipped. Behind him, Truc Lam stayed quiet against his chest, soothed by his warmth and the steady rhythm of his breathing. Occasionally, she made a small sound, and each time, he responded immediately, either by adjusting her position slightly or speaking softly to her without stopping his work. The sky slowly shifted color. The bright blue softened. The light turned warmer. Time was running out. There was one last light to install, further out near the far edge of the yard. He walked there quickly, tools in hand, his steps more urgent now. The ground beneath his feet was familiar, but the pressure in his chest grew heavier, not from fear, but from responsibility. He couldn't leave this unfinished, not after last night, not after seeing how vulnerable everything felt in the dark. He worked faster, securing the final connections, tightening everything carefully. His fingers moved with practiced efficiency, even as the light around him slowly dimmed. Then, he stepped back. He took a breath, and he switched it on. The light flickered once, then held steady. A soft glow spread across the far edge of the yard. He didn't stop there. He walked back toward the house and turned on each light one by one. Inside, outside, along the path, near the garden, each one came to life, pushing the darkness further away. By the time the sun dipped low and the first shadows of evening stretched across the ground, the house was no longer surrounded by uncertainty. It was surrounded by light. Trieu Duong stood there quietly, holding Truc Lam close against his chest. The gentle glow from the new lights reflected softly on her face. She remained calm, safe, unaware of the long day her father had just carried them through. He looked around one last time. Every corner was visible now. Every path was clear. Every space that had once been hidden in darkness now felt watched over. And in that quiet moment, as night finally settled in, there was no more rushing, no more urgency, only a simple, steady feeling. Tonight would be different. After a long, anxious night caring for his 3-month-old daughter, Truc Lam, through a fever in a dimly lit house, Trieu Duong realizes how unsafe the darkness feels. Determined to protect her, he spends the morning harvesting cucumbers and carries her with him to the market, hoping to earn enough money for better lighting. Despite his exhaustion, every step he takes is guided by his love and responsibility as a father. After selling the vegetables, he buys lights and quickly returns home, racing against time. Throughout the afternoon, he works carefully while keeping Truc Lam close, stopping whenever she needs him. As evening approaches, he manages to install all the lights just in time, turning their once shadowy home into a safe, warm space filled with light and care.